Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his article, The Case of the Obliging Stranger, William Gass is going to make a really important distinction, at least for the purposes of the article and what we can learn from it, between what he calls clear cases and unclear cases in ethics, in moral judgment, in our behavior, and whether we approve or condemn things, and whether we need to give reasons for that. And he's going to talk about cases like that of the obliging stranger being cases that he calls clear. So clear is a bit of a technical term here, but he's also gesturing at something that he thinks that we should get. So just to review very quickly, what is this case? I approach a stranger on the street and I say, I want to do an experiment. Will you help me with that? The stranger is obliging. I lead him away. I strike his head with the broad of an axe. I cart him home. I place him buttered and trussed in an ample electric oven. I go off to play poker with friends and forget about the obliging stranger in the stove. When I return, I realize I've overbaked my specimen and the experiment is ruined, right? And he's saying, if you don't condemn that, there's something wrong with you, and any moral theory that doesn't condemn that, something is wrong with that moral theory. He brings up several other cases that he thinks are similarly clear. For example, 3 children are killed by a drunken driver. A family perishes in a sudden fire. Now, with a sudden fire, it might not be wrong. It might be viewed as, this is clearly bad, right? Crowded bleachers collapse. And he says, who is puzzled, asking why these things are terrible, why these things are wrong? When is such a question asked? Well, when things are not clear, but these are cases that do seem to be clear. And there he's actually going to give an example of an unclear case. So it might be helpful just to mention that, and also to give a little bit of background. So he says, those impious creatures at the movies today, which is the Lord's. Okay, so that's on a Sunday, right? People are going to see a movie. It helps to know a little bit something about where Gass was writing this. He was teaching at Purdue University in the 1950s in Indiana, a state that had what are called blue laws about all sorts of things. For example, until fairly recently, you could not buy any sort of alcohol in Indiana on Sundays. Why? Because, there was a religious motivation behind it. It was, the Lord's Day, and the population of Indiana, which is quite religiously diverse, at least agreed to some degree, at least the legislators, on those sorts of things. And so people could be condemning that, and you could say, well, wait a second. What's wrong with going to see the movies on Sunday? You think God cares about that? Unclear case, right? Now, he's going to tell us that clear cases have a characteristic that he will call moral transparency. That is, we should, if we're not crazy or we're not totally depraved, we should be able to say, yeah, I get it. You shouldn't kill the stranger and you shouldn't cook him and you shouldn't take advantage of him that way. Drunk driver kills 3 children. That's awful. Nobody's going to say, well, it brought about a greater good or created more pleasure for people, or we could maybe find some way to justify it. If you are, people would say there's something wrong with you, and maybe you should feel there's something wrong with you. So that's moral transparency. And Gass says that these comprise the core of our moral experience, which is an interesting claim to make. He doesn't provide a justification for that, but it's nonetheless worth taking into account. And he says that, when we try to explain these cases, we often run into some problems. Not just because they're difficult to explain, but because when we explain them, as he says, we sound comic. As anyone does who gives elaborate reasons for the obvious, especially when these reasons are so shamefaced before reality, so miserably beside the point. And he says, what we must explain is not why these cases have the moral nature they do, because that doesn't actually require explaining, except to somebody who's being obstinate or foolish, perhaps. We need to explain why are they so clear, right? That's the puzzle here. So, we're going to see if we can do that, and he attempts to do that in here. But we should jump ahead in the article to where he starts talking about unclear cases. Well, what happens with these, and what are unclear cases? He says, I would be satisfied to show there are clear ones, but the unclear ones are more interesting, and there are more of them. How do we decide about blue laws, supposing that there's nothing to decide about the obliging stranger, except how to prevent the occurrence from happening again? How do we arbitrate conflicts of duty where each duty even may be clear? What of principles? Are there none? Are they not used by people? So he says, I'm going to put off those questions to another time, but I will give you some examples of different kinds of unclear cases. So he says that there are some cases where there's some sort of doubt at work. And so what do we do in a case like that? Well, we try to figure out what we're confused about, what it is that we need to know more about, and we start seeking out relevant facts. Not all the facts that are there, but facts that will help us arrive at a better understanding. And he even uses the word description of the situation. So he's got a great case here. We start out with, she left her husband with a broken hand and took the children. And, we hear that and we're like, well, she's doing the wrong thing, right? She's the person who is doing something bad. And then we find out, well, he broke his hand on her head. Dear me. But even so, now we're kind of wavering back and forth. He beat her every Thursday after tea, and she finally couldn't stand it any longer. Okay, so now we're like, maybe she's got a good reason. But the person responds, of course, but the poor children. He beat them too. My, and was there no other way? The court would not grant her an injunction. Why not? Judge Bridal Goose is a fool. Of course she did right, no doubt about it. So we started with, she's in the wrong, and as we get more facts about the situation, we shift to seeing, oh no, she did what she ought to do. She would have been doing something bad, something wrong, leaving the children in that situation. She should have done that, leaving her husband with a broken hand and taking the children. And so he says, if more facts don't clear the case, what can we do? Well, we try to redescribe it, emphasizing first this fact, and then until it's clear, or until we have several clear versions of the original model. And he says that's when we get into a lot of ethical disputes due to the possession by the contending parties of different accounts of the same occasion, all satisfactorily clear. So some unclear cases will eventually become clear. Some will become cases where we have several clear alternatives that are incompatible with each other. And he says these sort of disputes become particularly acrimonious and they can't be settled until an agreement is reached about the true description of the case. And if you don't reach that description, well, you'll just have to disagree. He says that there are other cases where there could be conflicts of duty that are perfectly clear, but there's also unclear conflicts of duty. And what do we do in that case? We try to clarify them. And sometimes the tug of obligations is so equal as to provide no reasonable solution, so some are actually undecidable. So there are unclear cases where they still remain at a certain level unclear. And this is how most of us muddle through life. The clear cases, we don't have to think about it too much. Don't put the stranger in the oven. Don't knock him over the head. That's wrong. Drunk driver kills 3 children. That's bad. We don't have to think about reasons why it's bad or if it truly is bad. Unclear cases, okay, we have got to think about those a bit more. We have to discuss those. But we're not usually doing it by saying, well, Kant would say, or let's look at this the way that Jeremy Bentham would, or the other things that ethical theorists typically do, if gas is right. Now, moral theorists have kind of a weird attitude towards this. On the one hand, as he's going to say, that the moral theorist, when it comes to these sort of clear cases, is going to acknowledge that condemning the stranger is the right thing to do. Or condemning the person who killed the obliging stranger is the right thing to do. Condemning the drunk driver is the right thing to do. And he says that any moralist will throw over his theory if it reverses the decision on cases like the obliging stranger. The most persuasive criticism of any ethical system has always been the demonstration that the system countenances moral absurdities, right? Things that just don't make sense. So if you're doing ethics and your system leads you to say, yeah, it's okay to, deceive and kill and cook a stranger, something's wrong with your theory. But that doesn't mean that you have to say, aha, the case is perfectly clear. He says, the moralist will pursue principles that don't apply. They don't really believe in clear cases. They refuse to believe in clear cases. Why? Well, there's a whole bunch of different possible reasons. Notice that Gass doesn't say, well, there's just one main thing underlying this. He says, well, it could be that his disbelief is an absolute presupposition with him. It's part of his methodological commitments, part of his notion of profundity and the nature of philosophy, part of his reverence for intellectual humility, part of his fear of being arbitrary, right? So even clear cases, he'll be like, we should think about this more. What truly is wrong with running some children over or deceiving and killing and cooking the obliging stranger? We need to dig into this a bit more. And you could say, why would you need to do that? Well, we don't want to be hasty in our decision making. We want to have principles that we can truly rest on. And he goes on and he's going to say that, we could look at 2 main reasons why, or 2 main approaches to cases where people wonder or doubt. And he says, well, you could be an empiricist or you could be a rationalist. And by this, he doesn't mean a commitment to the historical movements of British empiricism or continental rationalism in the 17th and 18th centuries. He means general approaches that he's talked about a little bit earlier. One is the intuitive or deductive approach, that's the rationalist approach, and the other is the inductive or empirical approach, scientific approach, that would be, the opposite of it. And he says that the empiricist has a hatred of certainty. His reasons are not entirely methodological. Most are political. Certainty is evil. It's dictatorial. It's undemocratic. We should scrutinize all cases equally, right? And the rationalist also understands that principles can be based on other principles and they have to go back, right? So there's all of that going on. And he says they're right to criticize each other. The empiricist is right. The deductive ethic rests on arbitrary postulation. The rationalist is right. The inductive ethic does not exist, or it's arbitrary values disguised as facts. And he says both are guilty of the most elaborate and flagrant rationalizations. Both know what it is they wish to save. Neither is going to be surprised by what turns out to be good or bad. What are they doing? This is a great phrase. They're asking of their methods answers their methods cannot give. So why are they farting around with these methods of theirs? Is it, to stay employed, to have something to say, to feel important? All of these could be possible motives as well. And he's going to say, they're basically attached to their principles. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail elsewhere. Moral principles, according to Gass, don't really do what philosophers pretend that they do, or other people think that they do as well. They are attached to having principles and to using those principles, perhaps in the same way that somebody who has a sports car would like to take that sports car out on the road and drive it fast. What's the point of having a sports car? Just to look at it, to tinker around with it? No, it's to drive it fast. Or having beautiful fishing rods and lures. Well, you go fishing with that. You got moral principles. What do you do with them? You put them to work with cases where, according to Gass, they're kind of out of place, and you don't actually need them in order to be able to decide. Interestingly, not only the clear cases, you should be able to figure them out without moral principles. Even the unclear cases, it turns out, they're not really that helpful, but philosophers act as if they are, and that allows them to keep on doing moral philosophy, even though it doesn't seem to be quite what we need. So here's the distinction right at the core of the work between clear and unclear cases and how they wind up being handled.